Vanilla Overwatch. Why is it so fondly remembered? In light of many additions and changes to the game, it's not a rare occurrence to see players longing for the glory days of Overwatch. As somebody who, quite frankly, has gotten bored of the current state that World of Warcraft is in, I am, in very curious fashion, looking forward to the release of classic WoW this summer. And that has got me thinking. Sure, it's not been like a decade, but Overwatch in its 3-year lifespan has seen a number of changes. The game we play today is fairly different than the game we played at launch, and the player base too has matured, evolved, and to a certain degree, changed. Today, I want to take a trip down memory lane. I went into my archive to check out some of my very first Overwatch videos. But don't worry, I'm not gonna make you watch this cringe fest, but I did go through a number of these and made some interesting realizations. In today's video, I want to make a subjective assessment of what has changed in Overwatch if we compare the launch product to the game we play today. Would it really be that good of an idea to go back and play that version of the game, much like many World of Warcraft fans can't wait to play vanilla WoW again? Well, let's find out. One of the very first things I noticed when looking at my old gameplay is that people were bad at Overwatch, and I mean really bad, me included. But that should go without saying, right? I'm fairly confident that were I to take my current skill in the game and use it back in the past, I would easily make for a top 500 player. Turning that principle around, I'd probably end up in silver or bronze if I put my past self in front of the current version of the game. And judging by my experience of playing on alt accounts and spectating lower ranked players, people who are currently in platinum would very likely make for grandmaster players back in the day. I think that the idea of our player base getting better on average over time is something that most of us can understand fairly easily, but it is very rare that we go out of our way to address that as a fact. Players are being made fun of for not getting out of Platinum or Diamond over the years, but quite frankly, there is a massive difference in skill between a Platinum player in Season 2 and a Platinum player in Season 16. An astronomical one. A lot of things that we take for granted today just weren't accessible back then. We have access to a lot of resources that help us improve. Overwatch is pretty much a solved game. We have YouTube videos featuring tutorials, tips and tricks, pro player VODs, VOD analysis, and the list goes on and on. While some of those already existed back in the day, the quality of the resources in place just were not anywhere near as good. There was nobody to tell us that what we said was wrong, so most of the tutorials came down to personal anecdotes of things that worked out for that one player specifically. There are a ton of things that just were not common knowledge back in the day, like the fact that the payload can heal you, or how capturing a point in 2CP works exactly. We also didn't know optimal flanking routes or the location of health packs all the time. Not to mention that, with us being new to the game, we were so focused on trying to learn it that messing up ability queues would happen very regularly. Like, Zenyatta players would be so focused on trying to aim that they'd forget to distribute Harmony and Discord orbs. There's just a lot of information to digest all around you when you're new to a game. It is safe to say that pretty much everyone was bad at every hero, and that in the most literal sense of the word. We had no idea how to play them. Our standards for what makes a good or a bad player have changed over time, so even the tiniest slip-up warrants players to call each other boosted and terrible at the game. The margin for error was bigger because we were literally incapable of using our characters effectively. And while squeezing every ounce of utility is still something exclusive to pro players in 2019, it is very rare to come across an average Overwatch player that messes up simple things like popping down a healing pad as Soldier 76. But our lack of skill and knowledge also had a big impact on the metagame. Pharah was a very strong character because hitscan players just were not as good back then as they are today. In 2019, it's common knowledge that flying your face into a Pharah as D.Va should be considered a standard play, but we just didn't do things like that back then. Naturally, Pharah has a much harder time today given that player skill has increased and more hitscan characters have been added to the game. One thing I also noticed was that Overwatch, from the very beginning, has always been a cheesy game. Players think that the addition of crowd control is what really added the cheese, but in reality, there were plenty of things that we considered cheesy even back then. Pharah aside, Bastion was considered the king of cheese and an absolutely broken character just for the amount of damage he could put out. I mean, try to think about that. A hero that sees a little more use than on Junkertown while playing in a composition that is entirely built around keeping him alive used to be considered the most overpowered, cheesiest character in the game. And quite frankly, players already had the tools to deal with him. Coming back to the realization that players were very bad at the game back then, Bastions would religiously destroy themselves by shooting into Genji deflect. But Genji was considered such a difficult character to play that most of us just never bothered to pick him up. And instead, we'd all call Bastion an OP hero. And similar things could be said for Junkrat and Roadhog. Fact of the matter is that no matter which time period in the lifespan of Overwatch, there were always characters that we considered cheesy and overpowered. It's not a thing exclusive to the GOATS meta and, Brigitte specifically. Not to mention that, beyond the heroes themselves, there were game systems in place that we just absolutely hated. Remember when Double Winston, Double Tracer, Double Lucio was meta on King of the Hill maps? You could just stack high mobility heroes to stall out the point almost indefinitely. And don't even get me started on the sudden death mechanic that many players felt cheated them out of a fair chance to win their games. Overwatch is and always has been a cheesy game. To say that there was ever a point in time where the game was solely about player skill is, in my opinion, just wrong. If anything, players could get away with, just using shooter mechanics because we didn't know any better. The game was marketed as an FPS, so it took some time for us to wrap our heads around the idea of actually using our abilities effectively and creatively. At the start, it seemed like a really broken play to put a McCree with decent aim behind a Reinhardt shield because many players just didn't know how to deal with that. But if you tried to do that just a few months later, you would already see a lot more pushback. D.Va players discovered the defense matrix, Junkrats learned to use their mine as a mobility tool to gain control of high ground, and Genji players got more creative with their angles of attack. Abilities have always been king in Overwatch, we just had to learn how to use them. Learning really is a massive key word here, because so long that players are occupied with learning a game, they are far less likely to observe and complain about things that, in hindsight, were disgustingly broken. I mean, anyone remember the launch netcode in Overwatch? Favor the shooter back then on the lower tick rate meant that you get bullshitted all the time. It would be inconceivable to claim that the netcode was any worse than it is today, because quite frankly, it still isn't amazing, and I envy pro players who get to play on virtually no delay. That's to say that, as much as it seems like we are a very angry bunch on the forums, and as much as we try to attribute that to the heroes and meta trends, we kinda always have been a fairly frustrated community. We complained about sudden death and netcode problems, we were bitching about Bastion and Junkrat, and we shouted to the heavens and beyond how unfair it was that we couldn't rank up because our teammates were holding us back. It's crazy to think about how the common consensus is that the Overwatch community has only gotten this frustrated over time, when, if you take a look at the past, we just always have been very vocal when it comes to pointing out obvious flaws in the game. I dare argue that we have gotten more vocal over time, not because the game has been getting worse, but because Blizzard actually listened to us. Many hero changes have been made solely on the basis of player complaints, so we have gotten very spoiled over the idea of our wishes being granted if we just complain enough about them. Vanilla Overwatch was plagued with a bunch of problems, a lot of which were stemming from a lack of tutorialization. The game back then did an even worse job of teaching players how to play properly. Counters were not universally known, map-specific mechanics were never explained, and some things were just outright stupid, like the sudden death mechanic. Video tutorials back in the day were lacking in quality, making them experience reports more than objective assessments of how to play the game. But because the game itself never went out of its way to teach us the proper ways of playing, it was very much up in the air when it comes to what is the right thing to do. Meta play has always existed, and it never revolved around the idea of player skill. Every meta trend at every point in time has always been hated by the majority of the player base. Whether or not somebody liked them solely depended on whether or not they could take advantage of it. The game was not universally better more than it was new. As soon as a game loses its novelty, player complaints are going to seem much worse than they did initially. Overwatch at no point in time was all about aim and mechanical skill. There were always things we hated as a result of finding them cheesy. The average player today is simply much better at the game than they were back then, and it shows. There are also things that are objectively much better today than they were back then, like for example the netcode and competitive structure. Having eliminated the no hero limit and sudden death mechanic go a long way in improving the player experience. Although we always have, and probably always will, complain about our rank not being high enough. All in all, I think that the discussion surrounding vanilla Overwatch is very similar to the one taking place around vanilla WoW. The game back then was not necessarily better. It possibly appealed to a certain audience more than the current version does, but more than anything, it's about the novelty of playing a game for the very first time and learning the ropes. There is no meta trend that can recreate the fascination of learning how to get better as a player, but the closer we get to our own skill ceiling, the more we tend to lash out and complain about everything around us. I mean, who wants to admit that their own lack lack of skill is why they're not ranking up. A lot of things that we attribute as unique to the current meta were things that we complained about all throughout the lifespan of Overwatch, like heroes and metas not taking skill. If you somehow have the opportunity to go back and check out your own gameplay from when you first started playing Overwatch, I strongly urge you to go and do that. Not only are you gonna feel much better about your progression and how much better you have gotten, but you'll also get Vietnam-style flashbacks to things that you hated back in the day. Things that we often suppress when we call new thing XYZ the worst addition to Overwatch ever. But I guess that's it for today's video. Honestly, this was a bit of an eye-opening experience. Overwatch has seen way more updates than I can remember. It was funny to see how, even back then, our community was complaining about everything all the time. But nobody called the game dead because, hey, it's still new, isn't it? It's crazy to see how much our perspective of a game can change once the novelty wears off. But hey, at the end of the day, all of this was a very subjective assessment of my old gameplay. See it as more of a conversation starter than anything that is written in stone. And feel free to have that conversation down in the comment section below. While you're down there, don't forget to drop me a like on your way out if you enjoyed this video, subscribe if you want to see more, and I hope to see you guys next time.